Greetings, everyone. My name is Joshua Gilliland. I'm one of the founding attorneys at the Legal Geeks. Thank you for joining us for our continuing voyage into the lower decks as we analyze Star Trek's second animated series and all the wonderful legal issues. With me is Nari Ely, as she is at her brand new desk and in her home office, getting set up and ready to litigate. So, Nari, how you doing?
Doing really good. Yeah, I'm super excited to be sitting on proper furniture. Anyone who's been watching the last few of these podcasts will notice the difference in my background. I'm no longer sitting on the floor on my coffee table doing this.
You're growing up now, so yeah, congratulations. So it's a good thing. It's a very good thing. So this episode is packed with legal issues and Easter eggs to multiple Star Trek episodes spanning decades. So let's rock and roll with some of the big issues that we see right out of the gate. I mean, let's just start with the idea of crashing a party.
Yes, so this is one of the first things that comes up is, of course, Mariner comes up with the brilliant idea of Boimler using his transporter clone's identity, who does have an invite to the party, to go to the biggest Federation party of the year. Of course, the actual Boimler doesn't have an invite because, like everyone else on the Cerritos, California class ships apparently do not get invites, even if they are currently heroes. So, in any event, using this brilliant idea, Boimler does actually get in, even though Mariner does not make it in as his +1. Now, it may be something that people have thought about doing. Not sure. It's definitely something that has been depicted in television and movies. But the concept of crashing a party, this is not the first time it's been depicted in media. There's a famous movie Wedding Crashers, all those kinds of things. Is there a legal issue with, it could be rude if someone discovers that you're not supposed to be there, but is there an actual legal issue involved with, gaining entrance into a party, either under false pretenses, so you're not supposed to be there, or maybe you just wandered in and thought it was open to the public? And the answer is, unless you are, generally speaking, unless you are also committing other kinds of offenses while being at the party, such as assault because you hit someone, stealing something, etc., whatever, setting those aside as separate things. The only real legal issue that is directly implicated by just the act of going into a party that you don't have an invite to could be trespass. So this is, maybe isn't an issue if it's some kind of gathering on public property. I used to live very close to the National Mall. If there was a gathering there that I wasn't invited to and I just wandered in, I probably wouldn't be guilty of trespass if they were also on public property. But if it's a private venue, and this appears to be a private venue, right? It was a convention hall. There was definitely a bouncer at the front taking names off the list. Then you are potentially trespassing. Now, so there's two, as with all kinds of offenses, there is always a civil and a criminal version of it. The civil version of it, probably not going to be on the hook for a lot of money if somebody did sue you, unless you, again, damaged stuff while you were there. But in general, the bar is pretty low for establishing whether or not someone is trespassed, meaning it's easy to. So unless you were picked up and thrown into the party, you're probably trespassing. Someone asks you to leave, you should probably leave. And this brings us to the criminal aspect of trespass, because there is, in fact, criminal trespass. It varies state by state, of course, as with almost all criminal laws. Which are primarily state rather than federal. In the state of California, the statute defining criminal trespass is actually a little bit arcane, let's say. It doesn't really lay out specific elements that take a trespass from civil into the criminal realm. It lists about 30 different examples of things that it considers to be criminal trespass. You can so just a couple of the examples, some of them, make a lot of sense. So entering someone else's property with the intent to damage that property, that makes sense. Entering someone else's property with the intent to interfere with activities that person is conducting there, such as a place of business. So that also makes sense. Entering and occupying property, also criminal trespass, and refusing to leave private property after being asked to do so also bumps it from civil to criminal. There's some a little more obscure ones, like taking oysters or shellfish off of someone else's land, taking soil, dirt, or stone off of someone else's land without permission. This is all penal code for the true legal geeks out there. This is all California Penal Code 602 PC together with some related sections. And refusing screening at an airport or a courthouse is criminal trespass. Criminal trespass in California is punishable by up to 6 months in jail and $1,000 fine, although there's lots of lesser penalties that you would be more likely to be found guilty of, especially if what we're talking about, again, is going to a party and crashing it, and maybe let's just say you get into the criminal realm because you don't leave when you're asked to. There's all kinds of infractions with small fines that you might probably instead get hit with. But in general, the three elements that distinguish criminal from civil trespass, and then we'll move on to the next one, sorry, I just get really into this stuff. If you can kind of deduce these elements from the examples that are listed, are that you've willfully entered the other person's property. So that's a pretty high bar of intent, right? Normal trespass is just that you intentionally entered, not that you intentionally entered knowing it was someone else's property you didn't have permission to. So that's why I said if you got picked up and thrown into it, you would not be guilty of even civil trespass because you didn't intentionally enter the property. You had specific intent to interfere with some kind of property right, such as damaging it or, like I said, obstructing business, and that you actually did in some way interfere with the property rights. So if you do those three things, chances are you're moving into the criminal territory of trespass and the police may get involved.
So let's address two other issues with the parte. One, can you impersonate a transporter clone of yourself?
So, yeah.
Because they're technically the same person, but they've developed different personality traits at this point in time.
And we assume them to be different legal persons. They have, Starfleet has presumably created 2 separate records for them, etc. Go ahead, Josh.
So yeah, it raises the issue of that I think he was falsely impersonating his clone because the clone's
who is also a Starfleet officer. So that does raise the game a little bit. I think, you know, the idea that if you pretend to be someone else, that implicates especially criminal law. If it's just like, you know, you pretending to be a private citizen and you're not stealing their money or doing something else with that, it doesn't spring to mind unless you have something, Josh, that you're thinking of that would definitely run afoul of. But the fact that he is impersonating in this, it would be the analogy I think would be like a federal officer. That could be a problem.
Very similar to when Thomas Riker stole the Defiant and except this is I want to go to the party. Still the same issues, still the same violations taking place. But building off your analogy about getting tossed into a party, how about getting beamed in? Because that now raises the issue of kidnapping, because you just move a person from point A to point B. Now, granted, that individual did want to go to someplace calming. However, where they dropped him in was a loud party where that person would be uncomfortable. So there is some intentional infliction of emotional distress going on right there, because it was an intentional act on Captain Friedman's part to use the emissary as kind of like a WMD at that point, with the ladies' man who appeared in the TNG episode who was DJing the party. So
I was gonna ask you, Josh, what that was referencing. Thank you.
the outrageous Ortega or Okega.
Okana, I think.
Okana, yeah, who hooked up with 2 female crew members on the Enterprise within 24 hours of each other. So things that are totally normal, totally socially acceptable, even in the 80s. So let's bounce into the next issue.
Oh wait, I wanted to just mention, this would be a whole, like, I just went on for like 5-6 minutes just about trespass. It would take me easily another like 10 minutes to talk about this topic, but I just wanted to mention it, which is that there are all kinds of really interesting legal issues that we could get into about the ambassadorship, because there's really, it's something we've covered on some other podcasts, so we can maybe direct you to those instead. But it's a really interesting legal issue about, you know, the essentially ambassadorial immunity, what it means. like all international law, there's a whole ton of practicalities surrounding it. But in any event, just wanted to flag that.
Extension of sovereign immunity, is it part of the diplomatic mission? All those issues. So some of our Black Panther material covers that, and I know we've hit it other times as well.
Yes.
Which brings us to Quark does have a franchise.
Yes, I'm glad we've definitely established that now.
And that is cool because it makes all kinds of questions come to mind. Is there a franchise agreement? So it's like a Burger King, or is this like a direct ownership? So he's not
like Starbucks, just if anyone's curious, a wholly corporate owned chain entity.
exactly. So what situation do we have here? And with the magnificent Ferengi Quark, I'm not sure which way he would go. I'm sure it'd be profit driven, but does he drive more profit by having control and thus control of his brand?
Mm-hmm.
Or would he see it as better to have a franchise model so that way he doesn't have to manage day-to-day issues and just gets a check? I'm not sure. So
Also, if anyone's curious about this, is something I've thought about a lot. I used to work at a Starbucks when I was a teenager, and I always wondered how you could end up with two Starbuckses like across the street from each other. And it's because they're fully corporate owned. So you would never have two franchisees try to set up two Burger Kings across the street from each other, because each one of the franchisees is trying to make their own bottom line, right? They only they only take home the money that they actually make as profit. But it may, in some circumstances, be better for the corporation or the entity as a whole, for all the Burger Kings, if you open two across the street from each other, because it then drives out the Wendy's that is also on the same street corner, and then they close one of the locations or something like that. So that is actually, if anyone was curious why you sometimes see two Starbuckses across the street from each other, that is why.
the more you know.
Yeah.
So I just found that fascinating that he did branch out and that the Quark.
I'm hoping they have a guest appearance from Quark so much.
I really do hope Armin Shimmerman does make an appearance because he's a very nice man. So with that, let's talk about what happens. We have Commander Data soap dispensers. Some of them might be lore, but that raises an issue of
I think it's bath bubble.
bath bubble.
Just to be exact.
Soap bottles. Was this done with or without his permission? Because California has a law about using somebody's likeness without their permission. And this came about, I'm fairly confident, back in the late 90s, there was a soda company that did some claymation ads with deceased performers. And the families of those deceased performers were not happy about that. So laws were enacted saying you can't knowingly, any person who knowingly uses another's name, voice signature, photograph, or likeness in any manner or in products, merchandise, or goods, or for the purpose of advertising or selling or soliciting purchases of, and the list goes on and on and on, shall be liable for any damages sustained by that person or persons injured as a result thereof. Did Data sell his likeness for merchandising? Now,
so I can't imagine that he did, especially to this particular person.
I could understand, especially not while on active duty still. So, like, it doesn't make sense for him to.
Also, Data does not strike me as the kind of person who is driven by desire for, I presume this is Latinum?
Yeah, there's that. I mean, I would understand the mindset of like, hey, I'm a hero. And he acknowledges people look up to me. Think of the episode Hero Worship. And so he's like, hey, people like me, so I'm cool with action figures of me. Like I could understand that logic. Bubble bath is something else. You don't associate Commander Data with bath time. So that just seems very suspicious.
Well, Josh, no, sorry, I'm just kidding.
I don't. Clearly, you have, so that's okay. Uh, but that being said, that seems to be just a big violation. So he could sue under this because it's his likeness. Ironically, so could Lore because it's
Yeah,
his likeness as well, and before. So
that's right. Good catch.
all the Sung boys could go after uh, who's ever done this.
Oh, couldn't Sung as well since he was made in his image?
Yeah, but he's dead by now.
I know,
So,
yeah.
but the whatever younger one that we saw in Picard, theoretically he could too.
Yes.
So big issues there.
And
That
I just want to note, if anyone who's listening is curious, this California statute that we're talking about refers to something that is generally called by lawyers as the right of publicity. It is a form of intellectual property. So intellectual property is intangible things, ideas, art. So we're talking, copyright, patents, and trademark. And it turns out right of publicity. It is statutorily created by states. There is, I think, I have to double check, but I don't think there is a common law right of publicity. So you'll have to check your state statutes, yes, to see. California in particular protects the right of publicity the most robustly. I'm sure it's arguable, but generally speaking, it's considered to be the most robust protection, meaning people's, have the strongest right to their own likenesses in the state of California. That probably makes sense since, or at least you can it's a logical sort of outflow maybe of the fact that there's so much media that's made here. There's so many actors and other personalities that live here that do sell their likenesses. There's an interesting debate in the legal scholarship community, at least, about whether or not it should be so robustly protected. Especially, you referenced, Josh, the case that kicked this off was a cartoon involving claymation with likenesses of celebrities who had been deceased. But so in general, the right of publicity, kind of cuts against what we normally think about in terms of protected expression, such as parody, or in general, for example, just historical figures of very great importance, like can you use MLK's likeness in a work of art or a movie, things like that, and in general, it just cuts it very strongly against what we normally think about as the kind of protection of and encouragement of creative expression that we have. And California does, in the case law, have some, how would you put it, limitations on the statutory right of publicity that the courts have created, including transformative use and other things that try to address that. For example, if you make a likeness of Data, but you do so in an incredibly artistic way, it's an impressionist painting, or you've combined him with other depictions of other androids in Star Trek or other artificial life forms, which is I'm referencing an actual California case in which there was a painting of Tiger Woods along with all the other masters. Those kinds of things, may transform it to the point that it's no longer simply selling his likeness on a t-shirt.
see if they did art of famous science officers.
Mm-hmm.
Like that could be very different. Here's to Paul, and like they just carry it forward. Again, but again, that's art. They're not selling merchandising.
So that is sorry, this is something I really was interested in, especially as a law student, so I happen to know a lot about it. But that's less of a useful distinction than you would think. And this is why the right of publicity is a little bit of an oddball in the intellectual property and First Amendment world, because we sell all kinds of things. Books are sold, newspapers are sold. So when it comes to, just putting something on an object, does that render it not artistic expression anymore? If I made a beautiful artistic impressionist painting that included Data in it, does it change it if I silkscreen that onto a t-shirt? Is it not still artistic expression? So it's an interesting problem in the law. There isn't an easy answer, because on the one hand, yeah, you don't want people to just, take someone's likeness and make the worst versions of this are not bath soap, Josh, as you can imagine. The worst versions of this are like if you take someone's likeness and sell it in something prurient, is the word that we use in law. So there's definitely, some there's a lot of room for debate here as to where the line should be drawn for protecting someone's right to their own likeness. But in any event, just wanted to flag that for anybody who's interested out there in looking more into this issue. Google the right of publicity and some of the cases around it. It's a really fascinating topic.
And with that, that's just the first few
I
minutes.
just managed to go on and on about this, but this is the Legal Geeks, so I think I'm in a good place.
You did the right thing. You have nothing to apologize for. So after they get data, they then get into a vehicle and they go for a drive to deliver the merchandise. And there's a police stop. Now, whether or not there's reasonable suspicion for the police stop, that does probably, they might not have had a blinker on or lights were out or something. There was some reason that's not a pretext to pull them over. What then happens is we find out that there's contraband in the vehicle and we get into a high-speed police chase. We both did some research on this.
Yes.
Because high-speed chases with the police are bad. Why don't you take the first issue of the duty to not get into a high-speed chase with the police?
Yes. So again, the big little caveat here is that this varies state by state as to how exactly this is going to be articulated. But just as an example, in the state of California, where both Josh and I now reside, it is in fact an offense to evade a police officer. So if you're curious, you can look up California Vehicle Code, section 2800.1. So any person who, while operating a motor vehicle and with the intent to evade, willfully flees or otherwise attempts to elude a pursuing peace officer's motor vehicle is guilty of a misdemeanor punishable by imprisonment in a county jail for not more than 1 year. And it lists a number of conditions, all of which are essentially that the person would have known that it was a peace officer. So it's things about like that the police officer's using their siren, it's a marked vehicle, it's using its lights, things like that. So there's like 6 different conditions, but most of them are focused on that. There's also section 2800.2, which is reckless evading, which is a felony. So we're going from misdemeanor to felony. If a person flees or attempts to elude a pursuing peace officer in violation of the previous section, and the pursued vehicle is driven in a willful or wanted disregard for the safety of persons or property, the person driving the vehicle shall be punished by imprisonment for not less than 6 months nor more than 1 year. That you can also have a fine of between $1,000 and $10,000. So it's pretty serious. Josh, do we think they violated either one of those?
Yes, definitely. There's no doubt. There's no reasonable doubt. If you take your vehicle upstairs, going through aquariums,
narrowly avoiding pedestrians, yeah. There's just like, it's not just that she put things in danger, she destroyed quite a bit of property, made people jump out of the way to avoid getting run over by their vehicle.
Yeah, and lakes aren't parking spots. Like that's
Not
something.
as far as that's actually, it could be a separate thing too, is maybe she has a citation for parking.
That sounds more like mob hit. So it's not something we do. It's like bodies don't get dumped in the river. Like that's not how this is supposed to work out. So just based upon all of that, there's still the old-fashioned reckless driving without a police chase. And that is a person who drives a vehicle upon a highway in a willful or wanton disregard for the safety of persons or property is guilty of reckless driving. A person who drives a vehicle in an off-street parking facility and a willful or wanton disregard for the safety of persons of others is also reckless driving. So, yeah, granted that sentence can be anywhere from 5 to 90 days and a fine of at least $145, but not to exceed $1,000. So, still not a good day.
Not a good day. Definitely don't recklessly drive to evade a police officer is all. You can take that advice to the bank.
If someone had gotten hurt or killed, that would bring up involuntary manslaughter.
A
And
lot of states have a separate statutory also for vehicular homicide. So that may be implied depending on what state you're in.
yeah, it's not good. So there's lots of reckless driving. The police were justified in going after them.
Oh yeah.
Like there's no gray zone here of like, well, I don't know what was reasonable. What they did was unreasonable.
Yeah. It is interesting that a lot of states have implemented practices or even laws to prevent police officers from pursuing high-speed chases. But this is not so much a legal issue for lawyers and judges to ponder on as it is a policy matter. But some states have chosen as a matter of policy that the risks and dangers posed to the public by a high-speed chase are generally outweighed by the benefits of capturing the person, unless, a lot of these policies typically include a caveat, unless the person being pursued is like armed and dangerous. Because you can often track people down after the fact if you've gotten a plate, if you've gotten a look at the person, if sometimes people take off after you've already taken their identifying information because they know they may have a warrant out for their arrest, those kinds of things.
So things like police helicopters. Some have gotten into drones. That's an entirely different issue.
Ooh, can of worms.
Big, that's, as long as they're not doing drone strikes, I think we're safe. But again, it's little things like that go, that's a little too Orwellian for our.
Yeah, I'm sympathetic to the skeptical instinct when it comes to increasing capacity of the state to surveil its citizens.
Just because we've used it in combat does not mean we should use it in law enforcement, because sometimes we get it wrong. And
it's a thing that I hear from, I will say lay people, but by that I mean often my parents. Like, well, if you have nothing to hide, what do you have to worry about? The thing is that in a free society, the question is always, why should the government get to look at what you're doing? There's a lot that we should be able to do in the privacy of our homes. The other thing is there's a lot that people can do that is legal but is embarrassing, or that we wouldn't want other people to find out about. And if we knew that the government could be watching in on us at any time, we might not do. We might conform even in our own private spaces. And so I prefer the default instead, which is, why should the government be able to enter the private space?
the mantra that only the guilty have to fear the police, that's a police state. We don't like that.
Mm-hmm.
We want probable cause, as opposed to, like, well, you charged him, he's got to be guilty. No, that's not how we work here. That tends to bother us. So no. So let's.
Josh,
Yes.
could I talk about the jurisdictional question?
Oh, by all means, break out the sieve.
Yeah, and well, it's also, I could use maybe a little of assist from you because it implies some maritime law, which is just sort of what I consider to be sort of like a big umbrella question here that, at least for me, got me scratching my head when I was watching this. This is why we're the legal geeks. Is, who was station security? They weren't Starfleet, were they, Josh?
Com badges.
Yeah.
I watched for the com badges. So where have we seen space stations before? We've seen them in some of the
Deep Space
original.
Nine, but that was a Federation space station.
Well, Bajoran with Federation invited in, and so security was both Federation and Bajoran.
But in both instances, it's a public, official authority as opposed to private security.
Yeah, absolutely. Was it K7 in Trouble with Tribbles? I don't think we really saw much security there that the station provided.
No, I think, you're right. I think we mostly saw Kirk and the crew doing so.
Yeah, and because the Enterprise crew was helping to make sure that the Klingons weren't getting into trouble. So episodes from Next Gen where like the ship goes into space dock, those were clearly Federation, Starfleet bases.
Right.
This is different. It's a
It seems to be private, right?
That, or it's Federation, so it could be still a governmental agency, but it's not military. So it's like,
Yes.
think of it as like you go to, oh, what's a good example? Uh, Maybe Guam. Like you're in a US territory and there's a naval base there, but the entire island isn't a base.
Right.
Compared to Diego Garcia, also known as Gilligan's Island, where you would have a big naval base that I think is just the base.
Hmm.
So again, very different. Or Guantanamo Bay, like there's no civilian component because you're in Cuba at that point.
Or, as I was saying, there's some implications here with maritime law. You're on a cruise ship flying an American flag. But so for anyone who's wondering why on earth I would sit here pondering whether this is the case, it's because it kind of matters as to at least what security can do to Boimler and Mariner had they caught up with them, right? So if what we're talking about is that either there's some kind of Federation security, so they are proper law enforcement, right? They carry badges, they have the authority to arrest and charge people under Federation law, then they can arrest them, they can within a reasonable amount of time charge them, but keep them in jail until then. However, if instead what we're talking about is that there's some kind of private organization, then first of all, we could be dealing with just your average mall cop. They could be authorized to detain and maybe prevent them from committing any further acts of violence or force against their property or customers. But in terms of like what they can actually do if they catch up to them, your average private security, they're not law enforcement unless they've been deputized, so they can't detain you and try you. They can't detain you, charge you, and try you. They can only detain you in order to hand you over to law enforcement. They can lead their own private investigation in the sense that they may gather evidence in order to present that to law enforcement or in order to pursue civil charges against you for things, or civil claims, I mean, sorry. But it's a very different world if we're dealing in private versus public. The other thing that really got me thinking about this issue, Josh, is it got me on like a very conceptual level here. What is this space station? Is it Federation territory? So therefore, is it, Federation law applies? The Federation shows up if something threatens them militarily? Or is it private and completely private? Because there are some interesting questions there. Is this a cruise ship, where you're in international space, in this case, international waters? In which case, as I'm sure you are very much more familiar with than me, Josh, about maritime law in general, if you were on a cruise ship, the domestic laws of the flag the cruise ship is flying apply. Again, unless the cruise ship security has been deputized, they could just, if you commit a crime, like you punch one of the employees or you break some property there, they can detain you to hand you over to law enforcement. They can't, execute criminal justice themselves. But they would definitely have the authority to detain you, to prevent you from doing further crimes, and to hand you over to law enforcement. And then the last one that I thought was interesting was, is this instead the Republic of Sealand? So if anyone doesn't know what the Republic of Sealand is, I encourage you to Google it. It's adorable. It's essentially as part of the defense against the Germans in, I believe it was World War II, I could be wrong, but I think it was World War II. Britain set up a bunch of essentially platforms that were actually grounded permanently into the seafloor, a fair distance off the coast of England, I believe technically outside of the zone of territorial waters that would designate it as their sovereign space. It had to be far enough away, right, to serve as a warning if there were incoming planes or other some kind of invasion. And a man moved in several decades later. There's a whole story behind it. I won't get into it. You can Google it. It's adorable. But essentially declared himself his own country because they were long abandoned after World War II. And there's really interesting questions, of course, as to whether or not the Republic of Sealand is actually its own country. But it does issue its own passports. It issues its own titles of nobility. It has its own currency. And to be fair, there are, as I mentioned at the brief mention that I did with the ambassador law stuff, a lot of international law is about practicalities rather than formalities. So for all practical purposes, the Republic of Sealand is a republic and its own sovereignty because England tolerates it being so. If someone showed up to invade the Republic of Sealand, I think they might still need to call the Brits to help them out. But is a space station analogous to that? And this was really interesting to me, Josh. Could it be its own sovereignty? And this was like, and it got me thinking about, normally when we're talking about earthbound terrestrial sovereignty, owning land, having land control over land is the touchstone to whether or not you're a sovereign nation. Although, we have very interesting maritime law that sort of reflects the reality that at least a long time ago when you were at sea, you couldn't contact, home base to get further process or instructions in a lot of instances. So captains had essentially fiat control over the legal processes on their ships. So it's interesting then, does this actually port into space when we're talking about science fiction, or maybe the not so distant future? Do you need a chunk of rock, a chunk of asteroid, something, in order to claim sovereignty in space? And I know this is probably departing a little bit from the episode, but it did make me wonder, what is this space station? Could it actually have its own sovereignty? As a practical matter, it probably doesn't, because as I was just discussing with the Republic of Sealand, they probably don't want to be their own sovereignty. Even if it's a private organization or person who owns the space station, they probably don't have the resources to defend themselves if some space pirates showed up, if the Cardassians showed up and decided this was theirs now. So they probably are part of a larger sovereignty that can protect them against those kinds of threats. It's also a lot of work and overhead to actually maintain a criminal justice system and all that stuff. But it is an interesting question, and we see this a lot in sci-fi, that you do have, like, I'm thinking about Mass Effect, where you have the caravan I'm trying to remember their names off the top of my head, but the race that was kicked off their homeworld because of an AI rebellion, and they have their own sovereignty, their own culture, and their own nation in this traveling caravan of spaceships. And it doesn't seem right that the touchstone to sovereignty in space should be that you've got a piece of rock attached to the hull of your spacecraft.
We don't need to get into comparative analysis of shows like Gundam or Babylon 5, which touch on space stations becoming independent nations, or at least attempting to. So let's table all that.
Yeah, I was going to say this is a slightly different universe, where in Star Trek, it's been established since the original series that space is literally divvied up by drawing lines through three-dimensional space and color coding it Federation, Romulan, Klingon. So that does solve a lot of this.
So, and somebody had to build it. So, and they have to sustain it. The International Space Station is not self-sustaining. Like, if they're not getting supplies, they're all going to die. And then they'll have to abandon ship so they don't die. So yes. At some point, commerce has to flow. So these things, yes. The space stations in Star Trek frequently are along the lines of port cities in space, and they exist for commerce to flow, which is why you see a Vulcan ship and multiple species docking and carrying on commerce, which is why I believe if there is life out there, the idea of like, oh, they try to invade us. It's like, no, I'm thinking they might want to open new markets, which is, there's nothing wrong with that. And if both sides have somewhat parity, so one doesn't get run over by the other, you can have functional, non-invasive relationships with alien races, because it's about opening new markets and exchange of ideas, and it's, there can be peace as opposed to one side wanting to obliterate the other. That said, I don't think it's an independent nation.
No, I think you're right.
I think it's just a Federation outpost. The Starfleet is heavily there. all the member races we see are Federation.
Mm-hmm.
So, with the exception of the Ferengi, but okay, because there's another Ferengi billiards room as well. So again, the Ferengi are there making money, so good for them.
I think you're right. And I wanted to say that you had a great insight, Josh, which is about trade. So, another reason why the Republic of Sealand may or may not be its own country is similarly, for example, so, if anyone could go set up, go take a banded oil rig and create their own country, let's say that you did that. And then decided that in my new country where I can make laws, all drugs are legal, and your little tiny station country becomes a conduit for illicit drug trade. What do you think will happen? The country you're off the shore of will probably embargo you, like probably station some ships around you and prevent all ships from coming in or out. And you kind of need that to get your food and water and all of that stuff.
You're self-sustaining, you have other means of survival. If you're not, fresh water is going to be a problem very quickly. So food.
But very interesting conceptual issues here. If any, again, law professor teaching international law needs some interesting thought experiments to talk about the concept of sovereignty. The space station and the Republic of Sealand are great ones.
Fascinating. So let's talk about some of the Easter eggs that are in here. And ones that I saw in the bar included the Guardian of Forever. We have the Phoenix, the first warp ship from Earth. We have the Doomsday Machine. We have the jukebox from First Contact that seems to be playing the music that was played on it. So that's all cool. I couldn't tell from the artwork on the walls what kind of references were there. And I'm sure there's somebody who's gone through and tried analyzing those and can list them all. So those were all Easter eggs I saw. Did you see any?
Yeah, is it an Easter egg for the full body life support
Oh yeah,
mobile unit?
Yes. There are the avian characters. We've seen them before in prior animated series. So the original.
Oh, okay.
So, so that was a little callback as well. So they're in the vehicle looked like the one from Nemesis that the crew of the Enterprise goes driving around in. So, so again, they do work in little homages, and I'm sure there are a ton of other ones. The entire model building, the model building kits for early Star Trek fans was huge, and a lot of those models are glorious to look at. And like I get that. You could see some of the model building groups on Facebook, and people work really hard to build a D7 battle cruiser or their own designs or a Miranda class ship. And it's like, okay, that's cool. That's just really neat. So the fact that they're down to like little miniature crew members and the model actually works.
Yes, it actually fires phasers.
And it has a warp core,
yes,
so that's explosive.
Overload.
There would be a warning label on that box at the minimum, because
you can shoot your eye out with that thing.
It's like there's matter, antimatter, going in for the fictional warp core. There's got to be licensing requirements for that. It's like you can't have a model aircraft carrier with a miniature working nuclear reactor. We don't want plutonium.
No, and actually there are lots of laws, Josh, about nuclear material and trying to. Don't do it, kids. Don't try it.
Yeah, there's the story about the Boy Scout who built a nuclear reactor as part of like a merit badge that, it's like, that goes back a ways, decades, but it's just like, oh my, pretty sure he got Eagle. But
in addition to a visit from the Department of Energy,
we reward that conduct, and I'm sure he had a great job later in life. But there would be a warning label.
Yes.
Now the the entire Doopler race, they could have serious survivability problems because if you multiply like tribbles, if you're nervous, how have they survived as a species?
I know, right?
How many of them are there? And
Or
do they?
maybe in their amongst themselves, they're constantly berating each other. Would that work?
It just, or I don't know. It's their medication that they're on constantly so they don't lose it.
Also, Josh, can you imagine the legal issues if we lived in a universe in which you or I could duplicate at the drop of a hat?
Again, it's a Boimler issue with having
Yeah.
your own clone of, but they're the same person, but they can merge back in. So that's at least convenient for,
But if one of them doesn't want, sorry, doesn't want to merge back in,
or gets, disruptors used on them and they're gone. Like what happens then to the rest of them? So
oh, and is it in fact a crime to destroy a non-original, right, duplicated duplicate?
and who is the original? How can you tell? So like there's
No,
that,
right?
because it's not like one gets a mark. So there's all kinds of weird issues with that. But since we just had the Trek 55th anniversary, I've been asking judges and other lawyers some Trek questions. So this is for you. What does Star Trek mean to you, Nari, Ely?
I apologize if any of these sentiments are things that you've heard in your previous interviews, but I do think Star Trek is an aspiration. It is a aspirational expression of what it means to be a free and just society, of what it means to be a society that simultaneously champions the rights of the individual to be who they are to the greatest extent possible, while at the same time unifying around that common ideal. It is the best expression that I can possibly imagine of what I imagine America to be. And yeah, if that is the future, I sign me up.
How has Star Trek inspired you to be a better person?
Oh man, so um, I think it inspires me on a daily basis to in the sense that it gives you an image of that aspiration. It gives you heroes who try to embody the aspiration of treating people fairly and justly, approaching everyone as an individual rather than a representative of a group. And I think at a more abstract level, Star Trek has always been very intellectually challenging when it's at its best, at least. It gives you really interesting things to think about, to really contemplate what the values you hold actually are, what they mean, and how they interact with each other. And in that sense, I think it has certainly made me a better person because I have a much deeper understanding of what the values I hold are and why I hold them.
Favorite character?
Oh, that's so hard. I have to say Worf. And I don't know if you've heard that one yet, but I mean, he's one of the first of all, just as like from a fan perspective, he's one of the characters who's in multiple of the series. He actually, this is a deep trivia that I actually have, is that his actor, not the character Worf, but his actor appears in one of the original series movies when Kirk is being put on trial by the Klingons.
Undiscovered Country, he plays his grandfather.
Yes. So he's in a lot of their series and across a lot of the time in the story. He is a outsider character, which I know a lot of sci-fi fans identify with, and just on a personal level, he is a Klingon being raised by humans. He has sort of this mixed identity that's going on, and so as someone who comes from I have a Korean mom and an American dad, I definitely identify with, you know, not quite feeling perfectly at home with either culture and being something a little unique and to your own.
So this is a hard question. What's the favorite series?
So I put a lot of thought into this, Josh, a lot of thought, gone back and forth over the years. I have to go with Deep Space Nine. In part because again, it's, you know, if Worf is my favorite character, this is one of the series that features him and his personal development a lot. It's, besides that it's a cast of really wonderful characters and actors, it puts the values of Star Trek and the Federation in the most challenging context, I think. And in that sense, because they're interacting with the Bajorans, right, who are a deeply religious society, because they're interacting with the Cardassians, who as a society at least are incredibly fascistic, totalitarian, but there are also Cardassians living on the station who become quite beloved characters. It puts those values and those ideas in the most challenging contexts. And I think because of that, gives you the best opportunity to really elucidate what it is that they mean. And, you know, again, why you hold them and why you think that they are the best. Because if you don't challenge those ideas that you hold in those ways with, you know, the hardest possible context to try to apply them in, so thinking Keiko trying to teach Bajorans who want to hear some of their religious context in their school, if you don't put your ideas in the hardest possible context, or as you and I, Josh, as lawyers, you know, come up with the best, strongest possible argument that the other side could make, you don't really know what it is that you believe, and you don't really know why it is you believe it. And so because of that, I cherish that. I also, Jadzia is like a really close second for my favorite characters. So I have to say Deep Space Nine. And of course, Captain Sisko is just such a fabulous captain. He really epitomizes, his actor also really epitomizes the tradition in Star Trek of employing theater actors, because his delivery of a lot of monologues is just like beautiful and powerful and would have been the star of any show on stage.
Very good. So final question about legal issues in Trek. We have trial episodes. We have legal issues that don't come up in trial but are presented in a very powerful way and sometimes very subtly. Of all of those legal issues, out of 802 episodes now, what one stands out to you the most?
That is a tough one. Oh man, because you and I have covered a lot of them together too. I have to say that it's the legal issues involving what is a person, I think. Because the law, you know, even as I just talked about, law that champions the rights of an individual has to be premised on a definition of an individual. What is a person in the eyes of the law? This is covered most directly when we're talking about, you know, Commander Data, or the Doctor on Voyager. But, you know, it also comes up in, I think, the episode of Voyager involving Tuvix. And, you know, what is a person in the eyes of the law? And I think it's just such a fundamental issue that we do actually deal with even in our world, in current present day. You know, where artificial intelligence continues to develop, and our legal system is, you know, may or may not be fully prepared to deal with an actual self-aware artificial intelligence, but we probably are getting there sometime pretty soon, where it'll be harder to distinguish between an artificial intelligence and a flesh and blood intelligence. Animal rights deals with similar problems in, you know, actual Earth current day contexts. How, you know, why and how do we distinguish between the rights of a human, you or I, and the rights of a dolphin or a cat, or a horse? And those are hard questions. They deal in philosophy, they deal in deeply held moral or religious beliefs. And they're very challenging questions. And it's a fundamental premise to the law. So I think those have to be it has to be my favorite issue, and those have to be my favorite episodes.
Very thoughtful. And also pop quiz for taking a stand on what you believe in. So well done. Well done. Did you watch any of the Star Trek Day celebration or videos that they put out with trailers?
Not yet. I definitely plan to. I had a quick question, Josh. On the celebration poster, there's a woman with short hair on the right side. Is she from the one of the animated series? Because I actually didn't recognize her.
So it depends which woman with short hair. One could be, it could be the upcoming animated series Prodigy.
Oh,
Or it
I
could,
didn't realize there was a new upcoming series.
that's one of them. Or it could be one of the characters from Discovery season 3, who was non-binary and prefers the pronoun they. So
Oh, but I know that one, and it's not her. So it's got to be the animated series coming up.
then that would make the most sense. So
Or they. I know them. Sorry.
good. Have to watch out and be mindful. So excellent.
I just want to mention that like that was a pretty obvious, I think, work in for the Trill. That you have an entity in you that has been multiple, perhaps even within that non-binary genders, and that gets implanted in you, and it's a blend of your consciousness and that consciousness. Whatever you were before, what are you now? That is such an obvious. I'm glad they talked about that, because that is such an interesting question of identity and personality, and yeah, the Trill is such a great work-in for that.
It's an interesting mental health question as well, for if you have someone who gets joined and you have a Trill symbiote that's lived 10 generations, what do you become? And what happens to your identity? So the idea of like the therapy that one would have, because it's one thing if you're like Jadzia, it's like 5 lives in, still a lot.
Yeah.
But is that wisdom, built upon experience? If somebody's lived like a dozen lives or 20 lives, what happens when is that overwhelming? What happens to the current host's personality for that kind of merger? I don't know. That's something that we would call in an expert witness.
Yes, definitely not me.
We're lawyers. We know how to do questioning, but we'll leave that for the psychologists and therapists who do podcasts and analysis of Star Trek, so they can explore that, because that is a weighty issue. So with that, everyone, thanks for tuning in. We will be back, I think, Thursday next week. So we'll do it that evening after we'll watch and be able to dive in, because there are things happening that Friday. We're going to be busy. And everyone, stay safe, stay healthy, and above all else, live long and prosper.